a chance meeting. I'm an old man now, with white hair and a slow walk, but once I was young and full of dreams. When I was a boy, I lived in a small town. It was quiet, with green trees and small houses. In that town there was a girl named Emily. She had long brown hair and a kind smile. Emily and I went to the same school. We walked together every day. I liked her very much, but I never told her. One summer, her family moved away. I stood by the road as their car left. I waved goodbye, but she did not see me. I felt sad for many days. Years passed, and I grew older. I worked, travelled, and lived my life, but I never forgot Emily. Her smile stayed in my heart. I often wondered where she was and if she was happy. Yesterday, something happened. I was sitting in the park, watching the birds. A woman sat on the bench next to me. She smiled and said, "Hello." It was Emily. At first, I could not believe it. I looked at her face carefully. Her hair was shorter now, and her eyes had small lines around them. But it was her. It was Emily. "Do you remember me?" I asked softly. She smiled and said, "Of course I do. You are Jacob." Hearing her say my name made me feel young again. We started to talk. She told me about her life. She had never married and lived alone. She worked as a teacher and loved helping children learn. She seemed happy, but there was something lonely in her voice. I told her about my life too. I worked in a shop for many years and travelled to different places. I never married either. "I always thought about you," I said quietly. She looked at me with warm eyes. "I thought about you too," she said. We both smiled. It felt like no time had passed at all. The sun was setting and the sky turned orange. Emily looked at me and said, "Do you want to walk with me?" I nodded, and we left the park together, just like old times. As we walked, Emily and I talked about our memories. We remembered the old days when we were young and full of dreams. We laughed about the silly things we did as teenagers. "I remember the tree by the river," Emily said. "You carved our names on it." I smiled and said, "Yes, it was still the best day of my life." She laughed softly, but her cheeks turned red. We passed the small bakery that used to be our favourite. "Do you remember the apple pies here?" she asked. "They were always warm and sweet." I nodded. "I still think about them sometimes," I said with a smile. The streets were quiet, and the stars started to appear. Emily told me about her favourite books and the places she wanted to visit. I listened carefully. I felt like I was learning about her all over again. I told her how much I missed those times. "I always hope to see you again," I admitted. She looked at me and said, "And now, here we are." Her words felt like magic. The night grew cooler, but we didn't stop walking. It felt like we had so much to say, so many years to share. As the night grew darker, we decided to sit by the park. The benches were old, but the view of the lake was beautiful. The moonlight made the water shine, and the air was calm. Emily looked at me and asked, "Do you ever think about what life could have been?" I paused for a moment and said, "I think about it often, but life had other plans for us." She nodded and said, "I stayed here, but it never felt the same after you left. I always wondered if you were happy." I looked at her and replied, I had some good moments, but I always missed you. We sat in silence for a while, just listening to the soft sound of the wind. It felt peaceful, like the world had stopped for us. I thought about how much time had passed and how many things I wanted to tell her. Emily smiled and said, "You still have that kind heart. I can see it in your eyes." Her words made me feel warm inside. "And you still have that beautiful smile," I said. She laughed softly, and I felt young again. The night was quiet, but it felt full of meaning. It was like we had found something we thought was lost forever. We kept talking about our lives. Emily told me about her years in the village. She worked as a teacher, helping children learn to read and write. "The children gave me joy," she said with a soft smile. But something was always missing. I shared my story too. I travelled to many cities, trying to find my place. I worked hard but never stayed in one place for long. "I always thought about coming back," I said, "but I was scared you wouldn't remember me." Emily looked at me, her eyes kind. "I never forgot you," she said. "You were always in my heart." Her words made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, hope. The stars were bright above us. It reminded me of the nights we spent watching the sky as teenagers. "Do you remember the shooting star we saw?" I asked. She laughed and said, "Of course. You made a wish, but you never told me what it was." I smiled and said, "I wish to always have you in my life." Emily didn't say anything. She just held my hand, and for a moment it felt like no time had passed. The night felt magical. I realized that even though we were older now, some things never change. The next morning we met again by the lake. The sun was shining and the water was calm. Emily smiled at me, and it felt like the years of loneliness had disappeared. "I'm glad we found each other again," I said. "It feels like a second chance." She nodded and said, "Maybe it's never too late to start over." Her words gave me courage. I asked her if she would like to spend more time together. We could go for walks, visit the places we loved, and make new memories, I said. She looked at me with a happy expression. "I would love that," she replied. We started walking around the village, talking and laughing like we used to. People in the village smiled when they saw us together. Some even said, "It's good to see old friends finding each other again." As days passed, we became closer. It was like we were young again, but wiser this time. We talked about our dreams and plans for the future. For the first time in years, I felt truly happy. I held Emily's hand, and we sat by the lake, watching the sunset. "This feels right," I said. She smiled and said, "It does." And in that moment, I knew life had given me a beautiful gift, a chance to love again.